Welcome to the Department of Healthcare Access and Information HCAI Fire Resistance Rated Assemblies presentation brought to you by the Fire Prevention Unit here at HCAI. Today, we will be going over fire resistance rating, building elements, the different types of rated construction, and much more. You can find the handouts ready to download for your use at the Handouts tab on the Go To panel. The length of this presentation is about an hour and a half, but may end early depending on how many questions you have. So what about the questions? If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the question section of the Go To panel, and we will answer those questions at the end of the presentation the best we can. Please keep your questions generic, but if you have a project-specific question, please send it to regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. Spelling is regsunit@hcai.ca.gov. If the presentation experiences transmissions difficulties, don't be frustrated. Please log out and log back in using the same login information sent by the GoTo software when you register for the presentation. Today, for presenter, we have Nancy Timmins, Chief Fire and Life Safety Officer, Fire Prevention Unit at the Facility Development Division here at HCAI. Once again, thank you for joining us. So Nancy, if you are there, I hand the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this presentation this morning. And for some people, this may be a refresher, and for some, this might be somewhat new. We will go through a portion of Chapter 7 where I talk about the fire-resistive rated assemblies, which more specifically, what type of wall is what, and dig into the excuse me, the individual types a little bit more. And then if we may do a second presentation in the future, and we'll get into more of the details with openings and protections with joints, penetrations, etc. But for today, we're just going to talk about the fire resistive rated assemblies, the different walls, and then horizontal assemblies. So with that, we'll get into it. And some of this is going to be me reading code to you, and I know that's not entirely exciting, but some of it just has to be read, but we'll tell stories when we can tell stories too. So this is taken right from the CBC, Part 1, Chapter 7. So talking about fire and smoke protection features, in Chapter 7, it provides the requirements for the fire resistive rated construction, including the structural members, walls, partitions, and horizontal assemblies. But then it doesn't tell you when you need the fire resistive assemblies exactly, but other portions of the code will tell you where these certain fire resistance rated elements are required. And then again, Chapter 7 is going to tell you how are these to be constructed, how are openings to be protected, and how are penetrations supposed to be protected. So other portions of the code will tell you where and when these are required, and then Chapter 7 is the how do you do this. So as with any of our chapters, you're starting with the very general scope at the very beginning. The provisions of this chapter shall govern the materials and assemblies used for structural fire resistance and fire resistance rated construction separation of adjacent spaces to safeguard against the spread of fire and smoke within a building and the spread of fire to or from buildings. So not only from fire spreading from within the building, but to adjacent structures as well. And as I'm sure you're familiar with, there are multiple use fire assemblies, and those are mentioned a bit in 702. Multiple use fire assemblies are fire assemblies that serve multiple purposes in a building, and this indicates that they shall comply with all the requirements that are applicable for each of the individual fire assemblies. So we run into this often. And yes, the terminology here, we're going to talk about terminology in a minute, but the terminology shown on this slide is this way for a reason. You know, for example, you've got corridor wall and an occupancy separation. What are those? That's a fire partition and a fire barrier. And then occupancy separation and smoke barrier you've got the fire barrier and a smoke barrier, but that smoke barrier is going to be a fire smoke barrier. An exit enclosure to an occupancy separation, those are both fire barriers. So that's why I've named them a little different in here, just to show, some common multiple use assemblies that we run into, and then corridor walls and incidental uses. So in that case, you've got a fire partition and a fire barrier, but a fire barrier that's there because of it's an incidental use room within that fire barrier. So when you've got the multiple uses, that section is indicating that the requirements for any, I don't want to say both, because sometimes you might have 3 different assembly types, but whatever you have, whatever assembly type you have, all of the requirements for that type have to be met. And then of course, the most stringent also has to apply. So if you've got a smoke barrier wall along, well, I don't want to do this because it's not good design, but along a corridor wall, that corridor wall's got to have the most stringent smoke barrier wall requirements. Don't use that as an example. That's not good design. But hey, just an example of when you have multiple uses, multiple wall types, assembly types, they have to meet what they require individually, and then the most stringent of all of them as well. And fire resistance rating, you can see at the bottom here, not to be confused with fire protection rating. So fire resistance rating, fire protection rating, 2 different things. So what's fire resistance rating? This is right out of chapter 2. The fire resistance rating is the period of time a building element, component, or assembly maintains the ability to confine a fire, continues to perform a given structural function, or both, as determined by the test or the methods based on test prescribed in section 703. So again, this is fire resistance rating, and keywords here are building elements. Well, the keywords are the period of time that the building elements or the components maintains this, but building elements. So what are the building elements? Because that's what your fire resistance rating is talking about. Again, we'll get into fire protection rating later, but fire resistance rating is referring to the building elements. The building elements are those items that you see in table 601. And a building element is defined as a fundamental component of building construction listed in table 601, which may or may not be a fire resistance rated construction and is constructed of materials based on the building type of construction. So again, I'm going to go backwards for a minute. Fire resistance rating is when you're talking about protecting those building elements. This is a definition of building elements, and when you go to 601, these are your building elements: your primary structural frame, your exterior and interior bearing walls, the exterior non-bearing walls and partitions, interior non-bearing walls and partitions, and then floor construction and associated secondary members, and roof construction and associated secondary members. So when you hear the words building elements, this is what it's talking about. Yes, you can read the definition, but also go to 601, and that's specifically what we're talking about. And then fire protection rating is defined as the period of time that an opening protective will maintain the ability to confine a fire as determined by test prescribed in section 716. Ratings are stated in hours or minutes. So similarly noted here, not to be confused with fire resistance rating. So fire protection rating, now we're talking about the opening protection. So what's an opening protective? It's a fire door assembly, fire shutter assembly, fire window assembly, or glass block assembly, and a fire resistance rated wall or partition. So again, don't confuse the two. Yep, both require a level of protection, but they're 2 different things, and the way that those are protected in the tests that those have to meet are different. So let's move on to, as I mentioned, terminology. So oftentimes in the plan review process, we'll receive plans that have walls labeled something like this. This is just one example, but an existing 1-hour wall, an existing 2-hour wall, a new 2-hour wall. So a 2 hour what or a 1 hour what? 1 hour fire partition, 1 hour fire barrier, 1 hour fire smoke barrier. What is it? What's the wall? What's the assembly that we're talking about? So, and again, this was just an example here too, but this is what we need to see is the name of the assembly. What is it? Is it a firewall? Is it a fire barrier? Is it a fire partition? Is it a smoke barrier? And have the legend match accordingly. And a good tip, and this is for those that have gone through the seminar, the tips from the experts, this is taken from that, is to show the fire rated walls on all architectural, mechanical, electrical, and deferred approval drawings. That helps in the review process where we get plans that are fire alarm plans, but the wall legend isn't shown or isn't shown properly. Where are dampers needed? What kind of dampers are needed? So this helps get that. Instead of having a comment, please indicate wall type, have it on there already, and then that can be reviewed at the time. So it just helps better review. And again, knowing the wall type is important. So we recently had a plan that went through and was designed this way, went through review and went through construction with a 1 hour. The wall was just called 1 hour rated wall. It was a new one. And this isn't a story to place blame. It's a story to say here's why it's important. Maybe the designer knew, well, this is incidental use, so it's supposed to be a 1 hour fire barrier. And maybe when the designer was designing it, it seemed obvious that it would be a fire barrier because it was incidental use. And maybe that was apparent to the plan reviewer, and that was seemed to be something simple. It's incidental use. Of course, it's a fire barrier. But for the individuals constructing the wall, they just saw on the plans a 1 hour wall, and it was constructed as a 1 hour fire partition, which may not physically look a lot different, right, with your layer gyp and your air gap and your other layer gyp, but how are those openings protected? So imagine having now to go in at the end of construction and or towards the end, and now have to add these components that weren't called out for because of the wall not being labeled. So it seems minor, and some of it might even seem, that you can assume what the wall is going to be, but don't ever assume. We have to review to what's on the plan, so please label the walls as what they are. And then a little bit further into the labeling for special rated wall designations. Again, this is these are just examples, again, taken from that same tips from the experts, so it might look familiar to some of you. You've got the top one, a fire barrier wall. In this top example, that's a horizontal exit or an exit passageway. So in this case, they put the number 2 with a little X to stand for exit or exit passageway. So that stands out from another rated fire barrier that might be rated for another reason. Or smoke partition that encloses lobbies, or smoke barrier walls which separate smoke compartments. They could have their own unique graphic, maybe an S or 1S to indicate the hour. So just to make it a little bit clearer. And then similarly with firewalls, what's the FW for firewall, and then what's the hourly rating for that? Again, just examples, but it helps in you want to construct what's supposed to be there, and to plan and to design and review it accordingly. This is helpful. So digging into chapter 7 a little bit more, what else and what should be on the plans in relation to chapter 7. So this slide is just again just some examples of what could be on the plans, and for fire smoke protection features, provisions for fire resistance ratings of structural members, exterior walls, firewalls, and fire barriers, the location and construction of shaft enclosures, provisions for the fire resistance ratings of fire partitions, smoke barriers, smoke partitions, and horizontal assemblies, provisions for the fire resistance protection of penetrations and fire resistant joint systems, details and locations of the opening protective, ducts and air transfer openings, and provisions for fire blocking and draft stopping in concealed spaces, as well as the references to the prescriptive fire resistance tables in CBC and fire tests from approved labs or fire resistance calculations. So including all of this on your plan helps to make plan review go more smoothly. And then of course there's wall priority. Like we're talking about these multiple use walls. We talked about those. Which one takes priority? And how is that shown? That is to be shown on the plans as well. Show details for the wall priorities when you've got a 1 hour running into a 2 hour, which is going to take priority. How is that going to be constructed? Sometimes you've got a 1 hour running into a 1 hour, but what is it? Is it a 1 hour fire partition running that intersects with a 1 hour fire barrier for incidental use? That happens often, right? You've got a incidental use room, like a solar utility room off the corridor. So a face of that wall is going to be both fire partition and fire barrier. But what takes priority? So we've created a little bit of a helpful cheat sheet too of listing the priorities of, and when you're looking at incidental uses, remember that's a cube there, so that should be that space should be a priority. That should take the priority. But anyway, here's a cheat sheet that kind of helps lay out some of that priority that you could take a look at. So now jumping into the wall types, a firewall. A firewall that's a significant wall, and that you'll find this in 706. A firewall it needs to stand on its own. If you got a building on either side of it, either one of those buildings burns and collapses, that wall needs to remain standing and with most of its protection in place. So firewalls are big deals, hard to construct properly. But anyhow, so we'll talk about these a little bit. So a firewall is a fire resistance rated wall having protected openings, which restricts the spread of fire and extends continuously from the foundation to or through the roof, with sufficient structural stability under fire conditions to allow collapse of construction on either side without collapse of the wall. So sometimes we'll hear, oh, this is just the fire side, this fire side of the wall. Well, fire doesn't know which side of the wall, right? Either building could be on fire. So again, the wall, the purpose of this, the function of this wall, it needs to remain standing if buildings on either side collapse, whether the fire starts on one side or the other. You'll hear me say that multiple times because it's huge. And it's a vertical constructed assembly only, so there are no horizontal offsets permitted in a firewall. Something to keep in mind there. And then what are the types of firewalls? Firewall and party walls. They're similar, but two different things. This is just a picture. You'll see it later in the presentation as well, but this wall did what it was supposed to do. It doesn't look good structurally, right? But as far as what a structural engineer might want to see, but for fire, the wall did what it was supposed to. It remained standing, and it protected the buildings on either side of what was once a building in the middle that was on fire from catching to the other side, and again that wall remained standing. And also think of the firefighters, because that's part of the reason these need to be solid as well. So if you've got firefighters in and attacking the fire in one building, you don't want this wall weakening and collapsing onto the firefighters and killing them. So these walls are hugely important for many reasons. So general scope for this: firewall shall be constructed in accordance with 706(2) through 11. The extent and location of such firewall shall provide a complete separation. Where a firewall also separates occupancies that are required to be separated by a fire barrier wall, the most restrictive requirement of each separation shall apply. And that's true all the time. We said it already, you got multiple use walls, they got to meet the requirements for each wall type, plus the whole thing has to meet what's most restrictive. So when are they required? This is an area of the code, or I should say the firewalls are it's hard to tell sometimes where they're required because it doesn't specifically say, okay, you need a firewall here, here, and here. But you've got to know the different components of your code to determine when a firewall is needed. So generally, when they're required, there's 3 different times. When you're separating 2 different types of construction, you'll need a firewall between those buildings because you got 2 different buildings. And then to allow for area and height increases, so you've got a construction type and you've got limitations on the size of that building and both the area and the height. And you want to keep that construction type, then you could have a firewall and maybe keep that construction type, but now you've got 2 buildings. But anyhow, so that's another one, is to allow for area and height increases. And then also to, when you have 2 adjacent walls of buildings that share a lot line, a true deeded lot line, not an imaginary property line, but a true deeded lot line. You've got these 2 adjacent to each other, and you would need a wall in between the buildings there. So those are generally the 3 times you'll see it, and then just some visuals to help that out. So in this one is when you've got the 2 different types of construction. You can see the group M is a 5B and the B is a 2B. So a firewall would be needed between those 2. And in this case, they would need a 3-hour firewall. And what hour rating does the firewall need to be? You would go to table 706.4 to determine that for your specific design or scenario. This is just a visual that's showing the area and height increase. The code wouldn't allow it this size with 1 building. So let's put firewalls up, create multiple buildings essentially, and be able to keep that same construction type. Or you could change your construction type, but we're just talking about firewalls now. And then a party wall. So this is the other. This is a firewall that's constructed as a party wall constructed as a firewall. This is the example for when you've got a true deeded lot line between the 2 different buildings. And then you obviously have to look at the occupancy classifications and construction types of both buildings 1 and 2 in order to determine what hourly rating that wall has to be, and then go to 7064 to figure that out. 7062 is talking about the structural stability of the wall. As we already mentioned, that it needs to stand when there's fire on either side of it. So the code states that firewall shall be designed and constructed to allow collapse of the structure on either side without collapse of the wall under fire conditions. Firewalls designed and constructed in accordance with NFPA 221 shall be deemed to comply with this section. So as I mentioned, it's really hard to build a firewall properly. That's this standalone thing, right? The floors, the roof, this wall can't hold up the floors and roofs of these buildings, because if those fall and collapse, that wall comes down. And we'll talk a little more specifics in a little bit, but generally speaking, hard to build. And it's hard to build new when the other buildings aren't even in place yet, let alone existing. So the code has brought in NFPA 221 that helps with having, when you need a firewall between existing buildings. And it's essentially using double fire barriers to create an equivalent to a single firewall. But watch how that's designed, because what do you need for the double wall rating? So if you're in a facility that needs a 3-hour firewall, if it were an individual wall, and wanting to use NFPA 221, the double fire barriers to achieve it, you would need 2 4-hour walls in order to have an equivalency to a single 3-hour wall. And then if it's a 2-hour firewall requirement, you would need 2 3-hour fire barriers. So not one 3-hour barrier, one 3-hour fire barrier is not equivalent to 2. It does not exceed 2. You need 2 different 3-hour barrier walls. So please make sure that that's in there. We've had designs come in where they're, oh, I can use NFPA 221. I've got 3-hour, here's a 3-hour fire barrier. A 3-hour fire barrier is not equivalent to a 3-hour fire wall. Remember, this is double, so you're doubling that wall when you're using NFPA 221. And again, it helps out with existing because it's just easier to construct. And then there are just some examples and some resources. Again, just examples. This isn't the way that you don't have to use this specific, but just where do you go? Where do you go to find some of these details? For masonry walls, you can go to the NCMA Tech Bulletin 5-8B. That contains helpful information. And then of course, JIP Association, Fire Resistance Design Manual is another resource. Again, that same picture, but bigger, is what did the firewalls did what they were supposed to do. Again, structurally, through structural engineers, in their mind, that doesn't look great structurally, but it did what it was supposed to do for fire. It stood up, it stayed standing, and it separated the adjacent buildings from the fire in the middle. This is just a generic firewall example. Again, there are many examples and plenty of resources, just some visuals to help you out there. So we've read the charging section for structural stability. The wall, again, has to be designed to remain standing, and even if the buildings on the other side collapse. And then there's an exception for this, is in seismic design categories D through F, where double firewalls are used in accordance with NFPA 221, floor and roof sheeting not exceeding 3/4 inch thickness shall be permitted to be continuous through the wall assemblies of light frame construction. So you heard me say that the roof cannot be supported by this wall and the floors cannot be supported by this wall, but there's a little bit of an allowance for this connection. And if this exception does apply to the facilities that HCI OSHPD regulates, because that's in the seismic design category that we're in. So this is saying, again, the roof sheeting that doesn't exceed 3/4 inch thickness can be continuous through this firewall. So there's a visual for you, and it makes sense, right? If you got something that's no more than 3/4 inch thick, and whether it burns on the right or burns on the left, if that sheeting comes down, that 3/4 inch or less thickness coming through that wall should not be tearing down the whole rest of that wall. And again, that exception is for when you use the double wall in accordance with 221. And then what materials can be used? Firewalls shall be of any approved non-combustible material except in type 5 construction. And then a fire resistance rating. As I mentioned, the hourly rating is not less than that required by table 706.4. So what does 706.4 say? Here are the different ratings. You'll see up top is where the I group is, I occupancy is, and that indicates that the 3-hour rating is required between those occupancies that are adjacent to the I. And then footnote A, always remember the footnotes. Footnote A says in type 2 or 5 construction, walls shall be permitted to have a 2-hour fire resistance rating. So not, if you're in and out, so not between 2 and 5 construction, but if you have buildings with type 2 and if you have buildings with type 5, you can reduce it. The horizontal continuity is firewall shall be continuous from exterior wall to exterior wall and shall extend at least 18 inches beyond the exterior surface of exterior walls. So of course, there are exceptions to this because we don't see this in buildings very much. I think in the 70s, it seemed there were more, but yeah, this is the charging section saying that wall, you've got that firewall, how does it terminate? In the charging section is saying it extends 18 inches beyond the exterior surface of exterior walls on both sides. But then there are exceptions. Exception 1 is firewalls shall be permitted to terminate at the interior surface of combustible exterior sheeting or siding, provided, and yes, I'm saying these words specifically when I say and, provided, or, these are big words in the code. So again, firewalls shall be permitted to terminate at the interior sheeting of combustible exterior sheeting or siding, provided the exterior wall has a fire resistance rating of at least 1 hour for a horizontal distance of at least 4 feet on both sides of the firewall. Openings within such exterior walls shall be protected by opening protectives having a fire protection rating of not less than 3/4 hour. So what does that look like? here's an example here. So as opposed to the charging section saying that walls got to extend out 18 inches, this exception is saying, okay, you don't have to extend out 18 inches if you do this. It come out on the sides of this, your openings are protected to minimum 3/4 hour, minimum 1 hour fire resistance rating where it extends here. And then more exceptions. Number 2, firewall shall be permitted to terminate at the interior surface of non-combustible exterior sheeting, exterior siding, or other non-combustible exterior finishes, provided the sheeting, siding, or other exterior non-combustible finish extends a horizontal distance of at least 4 feet on both sides of the firewall. So read it carefully, because in this exception, we're talking about non-combustible. So make sure to read through each of these exceptions clearly. Exception number 3, firewall shall be permitted to terminate at the interior surface of a non-combustible exterior sheeting where the building on each side of the firewall is protected by an automatic sprinkler system installed in accordance with 90311 or 12. So yep, there's sprinkler forgiveness there for complying with NFPA 13. And note that it says the building. So not just a portion of the building on either side, but both buildings on either side of the firewall and the whole building is sprinklered as required. And then for the exterior walls, where the firewall intersects exterior walls, the fire resistance rating and opening protection of exterior walls shall comply with one of the following. Not all of them, just pick one. 1, the exterior walls on both sides of the firewall shall have a 1 hour fire resistance rating with 3/4 hour protection, where opening protection is required by 7058. 7058 is the section for exterior walls. The fire resistance rating of the exterior wall shall extend a minimum of 4 feet on each side of the intersection of the firewall to exterior wall. Exterior wall intersections at firewalls that form an angle equal to or greater than 180 degrees do not need exterior wall protection. There's a visual for you in the corner to help sort out what did that just say. And when you're reading reading sections like that, dissect it, read them piece by piece. It helps sort that out and then put it all together. But there's a visual too. Or 2, so again, I'm going backwards. This is talking about your exterior walls, what happens at the exterior walls when your firewall intersects with an exterior wall. They either do what we talked about in 1 or what we're talking about in number 2. Buildings or spaces on both sides of the intersecting firewall shall assume to have an imaginary lot line at the firewall and extending beyond the exterior of the firewall. So you take that imaginary lot line and extend it out. The locations of the assumed line in relation to the exterior walls and the firewall shall be such that the exterior wall and opening protection meet the requirements set forth in 7055 and 58. Such protection is not required for exterior walls terminating at firewalls that form an angle equal to or greater than 180 degrees. So just a few different visuals for you with different locations of the same building shape, as you can see, but maybe the firewalls in these different locations or the imaginary lot line is. So the visuals will help out. And then horizontal projecting elements, where the firewall shall extend to the outer edge of horizontal projecting elements, such as balconies, roof overhangs, canopies, marquees, and similar projections that are within 4 feet of the firewall. So you've got a firewall and you've got a horizontal projecting element that's something like a balcony or a roof overhang. What happens at your firewall then? How do you terminate that? So this is the charging section is saying that that firewall extends to that outer edge of that projecting element that are within 4 feet of that wall. So if they're within 4 feet of that wall, you're standing outside, you can see in your mind's eye where that firewall ends. If you have a projecting element within 4 feet, this needs to be protected. Except, of course, there's always exceptions. Number 1, horizontal projecting elements without concealed spaces, provided the exterior wall behind and below the projecting element has not less than 1 hour fire resistance rated construction for a distance not less than the depth of the projecting element on both sides of the firewall. Openings within such exterior walls shall be protected by opening protectives having a fire protection rating of not less than 3/4 hour. So again, this exception is talking about when you have a projected element that doesn't have a concealed space, then you do the following here. Exception number 2, non-combustible horizontal projecting elements with concealed spaces providing a minimum 1 hour fire resistance rated wall. Excuse me, I read that wrong. Non-combustible horizontal projecting elements with concealed spaces provided a minimum 1 hour fire resistance rated wall extends through the concealed space. The projecting element shall be separated from the building by a minimum 1 hour fire resistance construction for a distance on each side of the firewall equal to the depth of the projecting element. The wall is not required to extend under the projecting element where another word to circle, where the building exterior wall is not less than 1 hour fire resistance rated for a distance on each side of the firewall equal to the depth of the projecting element. Openings within such exterior walls shall be protected by opening protectives having a fire protection rating of not less than 3/4 hours. So when you read these exceptions, dissect them. Read them piece by piece and make sure you're catching all of it. If you just read it all in one like that, you might get bored and move on. But read them piece by piece, separate the sentences, or imagine that they're separated as they should be, and then apply that accordingly and to understand it better, because they get kind of wordy. And exception number 3, and I'll give you visuals to help too, but for exception number 3, for combustible horizontal projecting elements with concealed spaces, the firewall need only extend through the concealed space to the outer edge of the projecting element. The exterior wall behind and below the projecting element shall be of not less than 1 hour fire resistance rated construction for a distance not less than the depth of the projecting elements on both sides of the firewall. Openings within such exterior walls shall be protected by opening protectives having a fire protection rating of not less than 3/4 hours. So what did I just say? There's a lot to that. So here's some visuals. Again, if you're keeping this presentation, make sure to keep the visuals as well. They help out. So on the right, you've got your exterior wall, and then you can see going towards the left, you've got this projection, and then you have your firewall. And you've got the dimension equal to the projection on each side of the firewall. So what's the dimension of your projection? What's the width of the projection? And now you're going where that firewall would intersect and go out either direction from that projection, and that you'll have that openings on that are going to have to be, or in that space are going to have to be protected with 3/4 hour. And then for the other exceptions with the concealed spaces or no concealed spaces, on the left you've got the one that doesn't have a concealed space but it has a projection, and you've got the firewall. What happens there? You've got to have a 1 hour. Shows you how to terminate with a 1 hour. When the exterior is 1 hour and the same openings are protected for 3/4 hour. And then what if you do have a concealed space? That firewall goes all the way through. And then do you have a continuation of the firewall if the construction is combustible construction? And then what if you have 1 hour? So match these up with they're in order, but match them up with the exceptions. They're in order of those. That helps you when you're dissecting those sentences and sections to have a visual to help understand that a little bit better. And then the vertical continuity. You've got firewall, so we talked about horizontal. Now what happens at the top? Firewall shall extend from the foundation to a termination point at least 30 inches above both adjacent roofs. So you got a firewall between the two buildings. It goes all the way up. Again, no horizontal offsets for the firewall, but then how does that wall terminate? All the way up and at least 30 inches above both adjacent roofs. But there are exceptions. What if you have stepped roofs? Which 30 inches from which one? Or do you even do that? So there are specific requirements for when you have a stepped roof, and you would go to 70661 for that. You have roofs of differing heights. And then exception 2, 2-hour fire resistance rated walls shall be permitted to terminate at the underside of the roof, sheeting, deck, or slab, provided, the big important word there, provided. See, now you've got a 2-hour wall, so this isn't okay for everybody's wall if you need a 3-hour, but if you've got a 2-hour, here's how this can terminate vertically. The lower roof assembly within 4 feet of the wall has not less than a 1-hour fire resistance rating, and another important word, the entire length and span of supporting elements for that rated roof assembly has a fire resistance rating of not less than 1 hour. So you got the firewall that goes up, it can terminate at the underside of the roof sheeting as long as that lower roof assembly within 4 feet of the wall is 1 hour, and the whole length and span of all the supporting elements for that 1-hour roof have that 1-hour rating. And openings in the roof shall not be located within 4 feet of the firewall. So you just butterfly it out, right? If you're familiar with that terminology. And you don't have openings in that 4 feet that you just came out. And then each building shall be provided with not less than a Class B roof covering. So in order to terminate the 2-hour, when you have a 2-hour firewall, in order to terminate it this way, like butterflying out, all these provisions have to be in place. That one's not a pick and choose. So yes, that's commonly called the butterflying it or butterflying out. And again, just some visuals to help you through with what that might look like. And then exception 3 with its visual is when, so instead of extending 30 inches up, what walls shall be permitted to terminate at the underside of non-combustible. Make sure you're reading these clearly, which reception goes with what, step roofs, 2-hour walls. This one's for non-combustible roof sheeting, deck, or slabs, where both buildings are provided with not less than a Class B roof covering. Openings in the roof shall not be located within 4 feet of the firewall. That was an easy one. And then this is another version of a butterfly condition, but it's specific for buildings of type 3, 4, and 5 construction. Walls shall be permitted to terminate at the underside of combustible roof sheeting or decks provided. So if you're in the academy, I would say underlined for these last two, you want to underline non-combustible in exception 3. And number 4, you want to underline combustible. And provided there are no openings in the roof within 4 feet of the firewall. The roof is covered with a minimum Class B roof covering, and the roof sheeting or deck is constructed of fire retardant treated wood for a distance of 4 feet on both sides of the wall, or the roof is protected with 5/8 type X gyp directly beneath the underside of the roof sheeting or deck. And that gyp is supported by a minimum 2-inch nominal ledgers attached to the sides of the roof framing members for a minimum distance of 4 feet on both sides of the firewall. It's just another version of the butterfly condition. And then exception 5, in buildings designed in accordance with section 510.2, firewalls located above the 3-hour horizontal assembly required by 510.2, item 1, shall be permitted to extend from the top of this horizontal assembly. And exception 6, if you have sloped roofs, then go to 70662 for the specifics. And again, no offsets. You have a firewall, it's ground to ground to sky. Think of it that way. You don't have horizontal offsets, straight up and down. It's not a firewall that way. And then you can't have a cantilevered upper floor above it. I'm not going to read through these as much detail as I did the horizontal and vertical continuity sections. In those sections, it indicated to go to the specific sections if you have these conditions. Again, if you have a stepped roof and you have a firewall between these two buildings with roofs with different heights, go to this section to determine how to terminate that firewall. Just a visual of what that looks like with the stepped roofs. And some of the visuals that go with the language. And there are exceptions to that condition as well, and that the requirements for how those walls terminate. So make sure to read those exceptions, see if they apply to your condition. And then again, if you have sloped, it led you to 70662. If you got sloped roofs, go to this section and look at the specifics for how the firewall is to terminate when you have sloped roof conditions. And then combustible framing in firewalls. Adjacent combustible members, so now we're talking construction where you've got combustible components, entering into a concrete or masonry firewall from opposite sides shall not have less than a 4-inch distance between embedded ends. Another one where visual is helpful. Where combustible members frame into hollow walls or walls of hollow units, those hollow spaces shall be solidly filled for the full thickness of the wall and for a distance not less than 4 inches above, below, and in between the structural members with non-combustible materials approved for fire blocking. So very specific when you've got combustible construction, which makes sense. What has to happen when these members are embedded into this firewall? So specific requirements for that. And again, the visual to help out what's okay, what's not okay, and what do these words even mean? Here's what it looks like. All right, we made it through firewalls. Well, we have fire barriers. The definition for fire barriers: fire resistance rated wall assembly of materials designed to restrict the spread of fire in which continuity is maintained. The term represents firewall assemblies with a fire resistance rating that are constructed in accordance with 707. So even though the definition applies to walls, remember that horizontal assemblies can also be fire barriers. So yes, a fire barrier is a wall, but when you have a fire barrier requirement, you're looking at a cube, right? You got top and bottom that need to be rated as well, not just the walls. Top and bottom are your horizontal assemblies. Horizontal assemblies have their own requirements, but they also complete this fire barrier cube, so to speak. But don't get it confused. Horizontal assemblies are one thing, fire barriers another, but they're related to each other. They come into play with each other. So again, you've got a cube. You need the whole thing protected. Fire barriers tell you how to build those walls. Go to the horizontal assembly section. They'll tell you how to build those. But those horizontal assemblies have to meet what the fire barrier is required to have. And then we'll go into, I won't read through all these as specifically just for timing, but the continuity, well, these are important, but the continuity of the firewall different since 2007, right? Here used to be able to, what some people call, dog housing it out, but 2007 and continues on to today's code is those fire barriers are required to extend from the top of the foundation or floor assembly below to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting slab or deck above, and shall be securely attached thereto. So all the way through, straight up and down, the fire barrier goes all the way through from the foundation or the floor assembly through to the next floor ceiling assembly or the roof ceiling assembly. And it doesn't, if you got a roof ceiling assembly, it doesn't terminate at the ceiling portion. That would be a membrane. It terminates all the way through, all the way up into the roof portion of it, the roof portion of the assembly. And then some exceptions for shafts. There are different ways to terminate shafts. You would go to 713.2 to determine how to terminate the shaft. And then interior exit stairways and ramp enclosures also have their specific requirements of how they terminate, and you would go to 713.12 for that. A visual again, that fire barrier goes all the way up, does not doghouse out anymore, does not terminate at that ceiling. Remember, a ceiling roof assembly is something together. The ceiling is one membrane portion and the roof is one, but together they create the assembly. So the fire barrier goes all the way through to the roof portion of that assembly. I know I just said it, but I said it again because it's always forgotten. So what are your fire barrier types? Shafts, interior exit stairways, and if you have interior ramps, and then exit passageways, horizontal exits, atriums, incidental uses, control areas, separated occupancies, and fire areas. These are all types of conditions where you would need a fire barrier. And general section for that, fire barriers installed as required elsewhere in this code. So other places the code are going to tell you need this fire barrier. 7 is going to tell you to build it according to 707. And then tells you what materials you're going to need, what rating that is those fire barriers are going to need. What do you need when it's a shaft enclosure? Then tells you to go to 713.4 when you've got a shaft. And then the interior exit stairways and ramps construction to go to 1023.1, and then enclosures for exit access stairs, which are completely different things than interior exit stairways and something we don't see too much of course. But if you have those, go to 713.4. And then for exit passageways, leaves you to 1024.3 for the specifics of what you need to do for fire barriers and exit passageways. Horizontal exits, go to section 1026 for specifics for creating fire barriers and horizontal exits. And then atriums, of course, have some special requirements as well. So go to 404.6 for your fire barriers that are for your atriums. So not done. Incidental uses, go to 509 to to determine the fire resistance rating. What does table 509 say that you need? Most of ours, and when you're in an I2, and you have an incidental use space, you're gonna need a 1 hour fire barrier and sprinklers. However, look at the table because there are some specifics. When you have energy storage systems and different electrical equipment, etc., you can have some more specific requirements and may actually need a 2 hour. So look at the table to see what the hourly rating is for the incidental use that you're dealing with. And then fire control areas, to what rating do you need for that? Go to 414.24. And separated occupancies, go to table 508.4 to see what that hourly rating is that you need for your fire barrier there. What do you need between your assembly, dining, and the rest of your I2? 2 hour. Typically, you're going to need 2 hour, but again, go to that table to verify the hourly rating between the different use and occupancy that you have. And these are, again, this is just telling you to go and just giving you the pictures to make it more entertaining. 509 for incidental uses, 414.24 for control areas, and 5084 for separated occupancies. 707.310, the table there. Remember, read the title of it. Some people just see a table, go with it, but remember to look. Are you looking at firewall or fire barrier? What table are you looking at? Make sure you're looking at the right table. This is the one for fire resistance rating requirements for fire barrier, fire walls, or horizontal assemblies between fire areas. So you're talking about firewalls here, I say you, but the code's talking about firewalls here too, but firewalls specifically for fire areas, in between fire areas. And then what's a fire area? 707.310, the fire barriers, fire walls, or horizontal, is not what it is, but it's telling what you need. The fire barrier, fire walls, or horizontal assemblies, or a combination thereof, separating a single occupancy into different fire areas, shall have a fire resistance rating of not less than that indicated in table 707.310. The fire barriers, fire walls, or horizontal assemblies, or combination thereof, separating fire areas or mixed occupancy, shall have a fire resistance rating of not less than the highest value indicated in 707.310 for the occupancies under consideration. So remember, when you're looking at this table and you see the word fire walls, remember this is when it's the fire walls it's talking about here are specific for fire areas, that when they're required for fire areas. Your fire wall rating that we already went through in 706 is when you need your firewalls for those reasons in that section. So what's a fire area? Is the aggregate floor area enclosed and bounded by fire walls, fire barriers, exterior walls, or fire resistance rated horizontal assemblies of a building. We're not getting into the details of these fire areas, but in CFC, you'll find some more information of when these might be needed. If you have them, you need to go here in the code for determine the requirements for those fire areas. Still on fire barriers, but talking about the exterior walls, where the exterior walls serve as part of a required fire resistance rated shaft or stairway or ramp enclosure or separation, Such walls shall comply with the requirements of 705 for exterior walls, and the fire resistance rated enclosure or separation requirement shall not apply, but then there's exceptions to that. So you're talking about you've got a fire wall and it's required because of you've got a shaft or stairway enclosure or separation. Then it tells you go to 705 for what do you have to do for your exterior wall? How does that have to be protected? And it says it doesn't apply there, but then you've got exceptions. Exterior wall required to be fire resistance rated in accordance with 1021 for exterior balconies, excuse me, exterior egress balconies, 1023.7 for interior exit stairways and ramps, and 1027.6 for exterior exit stairways and ramps. So it's the charging section is saying, all right, it doesn't have to be rated at the exterior wall unless it's otherwise required to be rated. So if you've got these conditions that are in the exceptions, make sure that you go to those sections to make sure that if your exterior wall needs to be rated, it'll tell you in those sections how. So yes, the charging section says you don't need to rate it, but you do have to rate it if it's otherwise required to be rated, and go to those sections that are listed in here. And then with the number 2, exterior walls required to be fire resistance rated in accordance with 1206 of the fire code for energy storage systems. So same thing. The exterior walls don't have to be rated unless they're otherwise required to be rated elsewhere in the code. And in 1206 for the energy storage systems, there will be specific requirements for rating those exterior walls when they need to be. So please don't assume that any exterior wall doesn't have to be rated. It may have to be, or at least a portion of it or a certain distance of it. So go to those specific sections for those specific conditions. That's kind of just saying the same thing differently. And then the continuity, again, it's the top of the foundation of the floor ceiling assembly below to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, slab, or deck above. And this, I just put this here again because I put the visuals here and the visuals a little bit later, but here, so this is, I don't think you're designing the top of your stairs like this anymore, but just an example of what that fire barrier termination looks like for those. Or visuals, kind of self-explanatory. Supporting construction, this is something that seems to be forgotten often, and not always, and this isn't just for fire barriers, this is for all rated assemblies. When you have a rated assembly, whether it's the walls or the horizontal assemblies, whatever's holding that up, it needs to be, the supporting construction needs to be rated the same as what that assembly is required to be rated at. But have the conversation with your structural. Sometimes you've got bracing that may be there for structural requirements for movement, but if you lose it, if you lose that bracing in a fire, you wouldn't lose the wall. But you've got other types that if you lose that bracing's could be holding up that wall. And if you lose it in a fire, you're going to lose that wall. So have the conversation with your structural as well to make sure you're looking at the right, you're rating what needs you are rating what needs to be rated. Don't forget the supporting construction. And think about too, when you've got a fire barrier, like we recently had a building that had the construction type did not require it required a 1-hour floor assembly, but there was a use on the floor above, on the second floor, that required a 2-hour fire barrier separation. And during construction, it was found that this 2-hour separation that's on the second floor wasn't supported with the 2-hour supporting construction underneath, because the building element for that construction type only required that floor to be 1 hour. So make sure to look at all the pieces. If you've got a 2-hour fire barrier on a floor that's only required to be 1 hour, that floor is not rated the same as that wall, and that supporting construction needs that same rating. So anyhow, this section talks about that, and there are some exceptions to that for different construction types. move through fire partitions. A vertical assembly, they're defined as a vertical assembly of materials designed to resist the spread of fire in which openings are protected. We usually see fire partitions where? In corridors. Those are where we usually see those. I listed the different areas where you see fire barriers. Fire partitions are your corridors, your 1 hour corridors. And they're in other, like as you can see in the language in orange here, they're also for separating adjacent tenant spaces and covered in open mall buildings. Obviously, we're not dealing with those. And to separate dwelling units and sleeping rooms, and to enclose corridors and to enclose elevator lobbies. That sometimes is forgotten. So we see them in corridors, but you may also see them for your elevator lobby. What can they be built out of? They're built out of the materials permitted by the type of construction. What are they rated? What are they required to be rated? In California, your corridors are required to be 1 hour rated. So yes, there's an exception for corridor walls to have half hour by table 1020.1, but don't even bother with it because that's not what we adopt here. We have 1 hour rated corridors. Other parts of the country, that is not the case. They can go down to the half hour and smoke. They have smoke partitions, essentially. But anyways, so just keep it in mind, obviously 1 hour rated corridors in California. Then there's exceptions. Dwelling units doesn't apply here. Type for group B and high rises. And then continuity. How do you build your corridor? Well, if this language changed, the intent and the enforcement is the same, but the language shuffled a little bit to try to make it clearer. I think it was in 19, it could have been 16 mid-cycle. But how do you build your corridors? You have to see the note on your plan, show the detail of your corridor construction, which of these 4 types essentially did you use? So what you might have been used to in the old code, it looks different in today's code, but again, the intent, the meaning is still the same. They just tried to clean it up to make it make somewhat more sense. So your continuity, your fire partitions shall extend from the top of the foundation or floor ceiling assembly below and be securely attached to one of the following. Number 1, the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab above. You can see in the visual, it's the top one, item number 1, that matches with number 1 here. Or they can do the underside of a floor ceiling or roof ceiling assembly having a fire resistance rating that is not less than the fire resistance rating of the fire partition. To your example there, number 2. So read this carefully too. These aren't exceptions here. This is just saying this is part of the charging section. Here's how your fire partitions extend to the top of the foundation or floor ceiling assembly below, and then are securely attached to one of these. Then there are the exceptions. Exception number 1, fire partitions shall not be required to extend, there's an extra couple spaces there, into a crawl space below where the floor above the crawl space has a minimum 1 hour fire resistance rating. There's a visual for you there. Exception number 2, fire partitions serving as a corridor wall shall not be required to extend above the lower membrane of a corridor ceiling, provided, the word you circle, right, that the corridor ceiling membrane is equivalent to corridor wall membrane, and another word to circle, so we don't just stop reading because you're like, sweet, I can enter that in my ceiling membrane. You just got to do a little bit more. And either of the following conditions is met. To 1, the room side membrane of the corridor wall extends to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab of a fire resistance rated floor or roof above. Look at the top picture for that one. What does that look like? And then 2, so this is your or the building is equipped with an automatic sprinkler system installed throughout in accordance with 903311 or 12, including sprinklers installed in the spaces between the top of the fire partition and the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab above. That's your visual on the bottom. So both above that ceiling portion would have to be sprinklered, and of course below the ceiling. And then exception 3, the fire partition serving as corridor wall shall be permitted to terminate at the upper membrane of the corridor ceiling assembly where the corridor ceiling is constructed as required for the corridor wall. So the ceiling looks like what the walls look like. You got your typically your 2 layers of 5/8 air gap in between. So that's what you're used to seeing for your walls. This exception is saying you do that same thing for your ceiling. So you turn that horizontally, you got basically the same thing. Then your corridor can look like that. So those, when you're asked for, you know, the note indicating how you're constructing your corridors, this is a great resource for you to help sort that section out. And please don't say tunnel, because if you look at all these, don't they all look like tunnels? Please don't say tunnel. Call it what it is, and indicate which one you're using. We get it. We know tunnels were used, and back in 50s, 60s, that there weren't all ton of different options, right? They basically were tunnels, but now there are different ways to construct that. So please don't tell us that you are creating a tunnel condition. Name it what it is and indicate which of these that you're using. And then exception 4 is more malls, so we're not going to get into that. And again, supporting construction, whatever's holding those walls up needs to be supported the same as, rated the same as that wall. So for us, you got 1 hour rated corridors. The supporting construction also needs to be 1 hour, and then as like the barriers, there's exceptions for 2, 3, and 5B construction. And again, to make sure to have that conversation with structural, is this wall for movement, or is this support for movement only, or is this support actually holding the wall up, where if the support burns down, the wall falls down? Make sure to have that conversation so you're protecting what needs to be protected. And then 70842 is section for fire blocking and draft stops in combustible construction. So you've got combustible construction. Please go here to determine what you need to do for fire blocking. This isn't really forgotten, but it's not always understood completely either. We can go through some of it. We're getting a little bit short on time here. But again, in combustible construction, where fire partitions do not extend to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab above, the space above and along the line of the fire partition shall be provided with one of the following. You see these, so a lot of you that are dealing with the SNFs, the skilled nursing facilities of the 5A construction, this is your world here. So the fire blocking up to the underside of the floor or roof sheeting, deck, or slab above using materials complying with 71821. So it's not just this section. What happens at the top of that fire partition, the top of that wall, from the space between the top of the wall and the roof sheeting? What has to occur there? This is the section to go to for that. And then in number 1, saying to also see 718.2.1 for the materials that you can use in that space. 2, draft stopping up to the underside of the floor, roof sheeting, deck, or slab above using materials complying with section 718.3.1 for floors, or 718.4.1 for attics. So again, make sure you're going to the section that is applicable to what you are looking at. And then exceptions to this: the buildings equipped with an automatic sprinkler system installed throughout in accordance with 90331. 1 or 1.2, provided that protection is, there's too many provideds in there, provided that protection is provided in the space between the top of the fire partition and the underside of the floor, roof sheeting, deck, or slab above, and required for systems complying with 90331. And then talking about where corridors, where the corridor walls are provided for sleeping units or dwelling units. We don't do that one very much, but the first one definitely. So the first one is you don't need the draft stopping necessarily in the I-25As, but you've got these other requirements have to be in place, like the sprinklers. What is fire blocking? It's building materials installed to resist the free passage of flame to other areas of the building through concealed spaces. There are exceptions for the fire blocking. And again, the fire blocks and draft stops in combustible construction, that was 70842. And if you used to look at all those in 718, not all of those exceptions are there anymore. You still have to go to 718, but exceptions 3, 4, and 5 are now in this section here with 708. And as I mentioned, the fire partitions and continuity have been reformatted, and as we have already read through that, fire partitions, how they terminate exterior walls when you have well, we'll just read this one. Where exterior walls serve as part of a required fire resistance rated separation, such walls shall comply with the requirements of 705, your exterior wall section, and the fire resistance rated separation requirement shall not apply except, so another section that says you don't have to rate it at the exterior unless it's otherwise required to be rated. So if there's a rating that's required for egress balconies, for the stairs, for the interior exit stairs, and for exterior stairs, then it does have to be rated. So charging section saying doesn't have to be rated unless other sections of the code say these things have to be rated. Here's a visual for you. The top one is we have a fire resistance rated corridor. You don't have a, sorry, I blocked out part of it. Anyways, you got the 1 hour fire partition there. That exterior doesn't have to be, but what if you have an exterior exit balcony? Then that exterior portion of the fire partition will have to be rated because the other sections of the code say it does. 711 is the horizontal assemblies. If you notice, that is not the title of this section anymore. They are still talking about that, but they changed the title to be floor and roof assembly. So CBC 711 is still for your horizontal assemblies, but people will get confused. Your ceiling's horizontal, right? Is that a horizontal assembly? No, not by itself. It's part of one, but it's not by itself. So they changed the name of it as floor and roof assemblies to be clear. This is what we're talking about in this section. The horizontal assembly shall comply with 711.2. Non-fire resistance rated floor and roof assemblies comply with 711.3. So what is a horizontal assembly? A fire resistance rated floor or roof assembly of materials designed to resist the spread of fire in which continuity is maintained. Again, I'm reiterating it just because we get this question a lot. Well, my ceiling's in a horizontal position and it's rated. Is it not a horizontal assembly? It's not. It's one part of it. The roof ceiling assembly would be the horizontal assembly. The floor ceiling assembly would be the horizontal assembly. And horizontal assemblies, of course, are important for completing compartmentation. Again, you have a cube, right? Just like when you have the fire barriers, you need a cube. You need top, bottom, and all sides. Compartmentation, same thing. This is where that comes into play. You've got, as we mentioned, your fire barriers. Here are your walls. Here's what they need to comply with. Now you got the top and the bottom of that cube. How is that protected? Same with smoke compartmentation, right? You got smoke compartments. They're not just smoke barrier walls. It's in a compartment. It's this whole cube. I'm not probably using the right word, but you got all top, bottom, all sides. Just a visual, just throw a picture in there. The general section for this, horizontal assembly shall comply with 711.2. We already read it. Horizontal assembly. Why is it? The horizontal assemblies shall comply with 711.2.1 through 2.6. So 2.1 talks about materials. 2.2 talks about continuity. Same as the rated walls. We talked about how do those walls terminate. We didn't talk about that. I just thought that when any rated assembly, when you hit the exterior, that's got to be carried all the way through the interior sheeting of that exterior wall. You're doing that with the horizontal assemblies as well. So you've got your rated floors, your rated floor ceiling assemblies. When they hit the exterior, that's got to be carried all the way through the 2 layers, right? You don't just end at that interior, that first layer of the exterior wall goes all the way through to the interior sheeting of that exterior layer of the exterior wall. So your continuity for horizontal assemblies is the same, just like your walls do. Supporting construction that we already talked about. Reiterate it, whatever's holding up that horizontal assembly has to be supported the same as what that horizontal assembly is required to be rated at. What are they? What is the rating needed for those? So go to 241 through 246. But again, there will be specifics in other portions of the code that will tell you what these assemblies have to be rated. When you're separating mixed occupancies, go to 5084, separating fire areas, 707310. There's for dwelling units and sleeping units. When you're separating smoke compartments, you also look at 709. And don't forget lobbies, there's requirements there for lobbies. You have to have that smoke containment at those lobbies as well. Even though your shaft is protected, you've still got smoke compartmentation that has to happen floor to floor. You see that with a lobby or smoke containment. When you're separating incidental uses, go to 509. Again, very similar to fire barriers, right? The sections tell you where to go when you have to have these separations. Go to 509 for determining the rating that you need for incidental uses, and then other separations, other portions of the code will tell you what those separations are required to be, what the ratings required to be for those separations. Like again, that energy storage system like we talked about. Ceiling panels, this section talks about laying ceiling panels and the requirements for those. When you've got an unusable space under a floor, what has to happen there. The materials, continuity, so assembly shall be continuous without vertical openings except as permitted in 712. So you got a hole in your floor, you got to protect it. Smoke barriers, they're continuous, either vertical or horizontal, and they extend exterior wall to exterior wall. This is just example. You've got the one in the middle, the smoke barrier in the middle is separating smoke compartments. It goes to exterior wall, but remember the wall terminates at the interior seating of the exterior wall, not where this is shown here, but that's not what this detail is supposed to be showing you anyways. You also would need smoke barriers in other places where the code requires it, like in an elevator lobby in a situation shown here, or at your stair enclosure. But the one on the right, that little square that's supposed to be a little smoke compartment in a bigger smoke compartment, that would not comply because those walls do not terminate at the exterior wall. A smoke compartment is a space within a building enclosed by smoke barriers on all sides, including the top and bottom, of course. The general section for smoke barriers, vertical and horizontal smoke barriers shall comply with this section, of course. What materials can they be, and whatever is required for that type of construction. And then what does it have to be rated as? 1 hour fire resistance rated is required for smoke barriers. And there's an exception for I3. We don't do I3s, we do I2s. That exception's not ours. Continuity. The smoke barriers, again, they go, well, I'm going to read this one. I know we're getting close in time, but of course this is important in our world. Smoke barriers shall form an effective membrane continuous from the top of the foundation or floor ceiling assembly below to the underside of the floor, roof sheeting, deck, or slab above, including continuity through the concealed spaces such as those found above suspended ceilings and interstitial structural and mechanical spaces. The supporting construction is going to be the same as the wall rating required for the wall. When you're using smoke barriers to separate smoke compartments, again, they go exterior wall to exterior wall. And then if they're required for enclosing lobbies, elevator lobbies, or refuge areas, then go to these appropriate sections for those conditions. This just says what I already said, outside wall to outside wall. Smoke partitions we don't really see. But as I'm showing in this picture, this is one area where we do with when your elevator, you've got your rating of the shaft that your elevator's in, but you still have a smoke barrier requirement from between the floors. And this is one of the ways, this isn't the only way, but using the smoke containment in front of the elevator cab door is one way to maintain the smoke partition protection there. But you can also have lobbies. There's not a list provided in the code where you see smoke partitions, but we provided one here for you. It's, again, corridors and I2s in other parts of the country, not here. We have 1 hour fire partitions. Elevator lobbies and sprinkler buildings, you go to 30063, item number 2. And then there's something similar to smoke partitions in 50942 for incidental uses, but again, this is going to have to do with us because you need the separation and the sprinklers. And what are some of the other things that have to do with fire resistive rated assemblies? Your vertical openings, penetrations and fire stopping, joint systems, opening protectives like your doors, your windows, your glazing. What do they need to be rated at? What's the size? That's limitations that are in the code. Ducts and dampers, you got concealed spaces, FT&L ratings, continuity we did talk about, but that's in here as well. Supporting structure we talked about, and there's more. So when we do a second presentation, a lot of these items will be, I don't know if we'll go through all of them, but a lot of these will be addressed in that second presentation. So that is it. Not a whole lot of time for questions, and I just threw out a whole lot of information at you. Your head might be spinning. As I mentioned before, feel free to ask your questions here. If you need time to process, yes, some people that hear this, read it and see it and process right away and get it. Others, you need to read it and think about it a while. You know, ask questions whenever they come up. This isn't just now or never. Yeah, you can contact me at any time. So Monica.
Yes, Nancy, you did amazing. So really good, really good. We have 5 minutes left, so we are going through questions, and the questions that we will not have time, we will respond by email. So Nancy, are you ready? Let's try to do as quick as we can. Yes. One question says, do we use the most stringent graphic symbol for a wall barrier that meets multiple fire resistance rating?
So we want to see all of it. So you'll show when you have a multiple use wall, we want to see the details for both. So if you're talking about the legend, if that's what you mean, what do we want to see on the legend? And not just the legend, but on the plan itself. Show both. So sometimes we'll see, you know, and you don't have to do it the same as everybody else, but 1 hour fire barrier, smoke barrier of the number 1 FBSB, if you want to do that. And then when it transitions over and it's just a fire barrier, then go ahead, take the SB out and put the SB wherever it changed course. Or same with fire partition. You got 1 hour, you know, 1 FB, FP, though that might be a little harder to see on the plan, so you maybe want to put a different graphic for that. Show both that so that we can follow that along the path that those walls traverse. Please.
Yeah, wonderful. That makes sense. Thank you. The next question is, I thought that all no rated smoke walls have to be minimum 1 hour fire rated now by definition. Is correct?
We have smoke barriers have to be 1 hour. Yes. And we don't have, well, I should say that those smoke, I'm not sure where you would see the non-rated smoke partition. Again, in other parts of the country, you will have that for your corridors, but in California, you have 1 hour fire partition, but the smoke barriers are also 1 hour.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you. Next question. So how much time we have? 3 minutes. Okay. Is the firewall really intended to stand indefinitely if the required, hold on, because it's moving now, the question is the required construction on either side is less than the rating of the firewall itself? Isn't the rating of the construction intended to allow occupants to evacuate in the given time?
So great question, because that's what we really focus on, our timing. And in I-2s, it takes a lot of time to relocate people. And yes, there are provisions for the different construction types that come into play based on timing for evacuation or when needed, or in our case, relocation. However, remember the firefighters. Well, the firefighters are going to be here fighting this fire, and if the wall's crumbling on them, we don't want to kill a bunch of firefighters. So it's not just the occupants of the building, it's also firefighters, as well as protecting the adjacent building. So yes, the intent is that wall stays standing. for the time that that table says it needs to. You got 3 hour, it needs to be 3 hour, even if you got 1 hour building on the other side that's crumbled and onto the ground. Well, it's 5A, you get the 2 hour. But anyhow, if you've got that, if it's required to be 3 hours, it needs to be 3 hours regardless of, I don't want to say regardless. The table says 3 hours, that needs to be standing for 3 hours. So it's, again, it's firefighters as well. We're protecting them too.
Thank you. Next, what are the main difference in construction between fire partition, fire barrier, and smoke barriers? I understand that fire barriers, any supporting structural bracing, requires to have the same rating as the fire barrier. For smoke barrier, there is an L rating at joints and penetrations.
So a few different questions in one, right?
Right.
So as far as what do they look like if you're standing there looking at it, and why do I need to call this something different if they both have a layer of 5/8 on either side with an air gap in between? They may, but the way those openings are going to be protected will differ depending on the type of construction, the type of wall that is. And then where the L rating comes into play, well, let me back up a little bit. Supporting construction, any rated assembly the supporting construction needs to be rated the same as that rated assembly. So that doesn't differ between the fire barrier, fire partition, etc., unless it falls under one of the exceptions. But so the supporting construction has to be rated the same as the rated assembly, regardless of the type of assembly. So it's not just fire barriers, it's all of them. And then for the L rating, that is for smoke barriers. And yes, that L rating is needed for the smoke barriers. And remember that could include the floor assembly or the ceiling assembly. And if you've got a multiple use wall, you may need an L rating, even though you're saying, well, it's only a fire barrier. Well, if it's a fire barrier, smoke barrier, you still need to have that L rating.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the next question, and questions are coming up now, and so I'm looking the screen and it is getting insane. So the next question is, what about utilities, piping, electrical, mechanical that crosses a firewall? One would think this could affect the structural if collapse occurs on one side. So what happens in those utilities for piping, electrical, and mechanical across firewall?
If those are permitted, so remember, it depends on the type of wall that you have and what it's there for. If those penetrations are allowed, there will be requirements for the support of those as well, but which will be in different portions of the code applicable to those to whatever you're looking at, whether it's mechanical or ducting or piping. And then there's also, just kind of crosses over, you got structural separation that's required versus fire. If it's both, if you have a separation there that's needed, it's needed seismically as well, then there are going to be some flex connections and such that come into play. If it's the firewall is there for fire purposes only, there are some other requirements in different sections of different codes and standards, which obviously is way too many to get into right now, but there are other requirements that will address those issues and the support of those components as well.
Got it. Thank you, Nancy. It's 11:32, so we are already over our webinar. So we got many questions. And Nancy, if it's okay, you will answer to those questions by email to the specific people, or how we can respond in general to those questions to let everybody know. But please, if you have any other question, don't hesitate to write an email. There are also past webinars where you can download the presentation handout and video presentation, like the CAN 2-111B, assemblies in the health facilities, OSHPD 3 clinics for the what, when, and how, temporary structure and uses, and is the CAN 2-108, engineering judgment for the CAN 2-703, 3.3. There will be, Nancy, I believe, the part 2 of your presentation, a continuation.
Yes.
So
We
go
could-
ahead.
Sorry about that, to step over you there. We could address some of these questions in there too, and some of them may automatically be part of that presentation because there are questions about openings and joints and such. I forgot to say that one piece about AIA. If you're using this for your AIA credits, I don't know if that's what they're called, then contact your specific division or region for obtaining that. Those CEUs, sorry, credit.
No,
Sorry.
that's perfect, Nancy, of course. So for any other presentation and to stay tuned for any update, remember to subscribe to our website at www.hki.ca.gov, and on the upper right of the screen there is the word subscribe. You will click there, you will provide your name, your email address, and you will select what area you would like to be notifying. For example, building safety and financing, design and construction, wherever you are interested, click there so you will get the notification. Please remember again, if you have any project specific question, to send those questions to the regs unit at hki.ca.gov. And Nancy, do you want to add anything more?
Thank you for your help. Thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for your questions. We will, or I guess it will be, I will we get to your questions. And Monica, I'm not sure if there's this, is that the same email you want those questions to go to that you just gave?
Yes, the regs unit at hki.ca.gov, regsunit@hki.ca.gov. So that being said, it's been a pleasure being with all of you today. Thank you for what you do and for doing your part in providing access to safe, quality healthcare environments throughout the state of California. And until the next time, have a good rest of the day. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Monica.
Thank you.